I appreciate your response, and it's so heartfelt and it's so universal. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of like death. We're almost hesitant to use that term. And that's so interesting because the one universality, perhaps, the one inevitability of human existence is that, as the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, everything changes. Everything changes. So why isn't it that we don't talk about this one seminal, inevitable universality of human existence? When we don't talk about things, that's often when we get ourselves into trouble.
That's true.
Yeah.
And nobody gets out alive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
We all have to go through the same experience.
That's right.
Let's have you wear both hats.
Yeah.
Therapist as well as a Zen monk.
Sure.
Let's help our listeners think about what that concept means, as well as what it means to prepare for it, I guess, to be, I don't know if you can ever truly prepare for it. I'm sure everyone is shocked.
I actually think you can.
You can?
I'll offer that.
Okay.
Well, I'll say first off that I do think a lot of the ways we think about death and we prepare for death is going to be driven by people's cultural context, their own values and beliefs, and that is supremely, as someone who used to work in hospice care, I will say that is supremely important. And there are practicalities, which is a whole other area of conversation, but are good to think about. Things like hospice care, advanced directives, treatment decisions, which I think need to be honored that are made by the patient and the family. So that's another whole important and good area to talk about. And I do think that death is scary, but I also think that the terror and the sadness of death can be transformed. And that's actually how mindfulness arose, according to the mythology of Buddhism. There's a scholar who I used to work with, study under, not really work with, just learn from, a great guy named Robert Gemello. He used to teach at Harvard, and he referred to mindfulness as the Buddha's gift to the world. And the idea of mindfulness, according to Buddhist mythology, is that the Buddha, he was this rich prince. He kind of lived this, sheltered and spoiled life a little bit, as this kind of rich guy who was pampered. And then one day he had encounters with an old man, then with a sick man, and then with a man who had died. He saw a corpse. And so he, like all of us, when we first experience, we learn that our physical lives will end, that we are mortal beings. He was overcome with sadness and terror. And so then it's said that the Buddha for 6 years embarked on a quest, did all these different spiritual practices, and finally, it talks about in the Pali Canon, the oldest Buddhist scriptures, that he sat down in the woods, and he even talks about in the Pali Canon, he went into the woods because he was so terrified of death and fear, and he wanted to face that death and terror and fear directly. And that's how mindfulness meditation arose. So the idea is that if you have a system of philosophy, for sure, whatever that philosophy is, but more importantly, you have a practice to make that philosophy a lived reality, that is how we overcome. And I think that's the same in therapy. That's how we overcome the fear of death.
What is death?
Well, I would say ultimately that death is beyond words and language and concept. It is the seminal change. There's a great book. I've read it with my kids. We have a copy of it at home. It's written by another psychologist. It's called The Fall of Freddie the Leaf. It's an incredible little book. Have you read it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's awesome. I've read it with my kids.
Yes.
And so I was talking with one of my daughters one day, and we read that book, and it was a fall day, and we're looking out the window, and, all the leaves had been coming off our big tree, and they were all in the yard. And, my daughter Erin got this beautiful smile on her face, and she was like, Dad, we're like the leaves in the tree. The individual life changes, but existence itself, the symphony of experience, existence itself endures. That's what death is.
Very interesting. So are we going from one state of being to another? Is there an afterlife in Buddhism?
I'm going to operate from a traditional Zen perspective, which is to say, I do not know. And I try to sit with that radical not knowing. People have a lot of powerful beliefs either way. People are atheist, people are theistic. There's a lot of heated rhetoric in our society. The truth is, no one knows. We don't know empirically. We do not know. And so as a Zen priest, I believe, as a human being, I believe whatever is going on, there's always a level of indeterminacy and not knowing whatever is going on in human existence. So what I try to do is generate presence and awareness and compassion, and I seek to engage things fully. And I don't know, but I like being surprised.
That's wonderful. Not everyone does.
Well, it's a practice.
It's a practice. Some people want some force to pull them through. They want to be able to reach beyond the veil and have something take their hand and pull them through or towards something.
And if I could just offer,
please.
I respect that and I honor that, and I've seen that, and at the same time, I think that human beings are full of potential. I think we can surprise ourselves by what we can embrace.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So this concept of I want to talk about it in terms of death, because everything's a journey, as I hear you say.
Absolutely.
Your journey through life. Some say a pilgrimage through life, however you want to say, the sacred space. So death is journey towards
change, towards experience.
So we can go from one form to another.
Sure. I mean, the great physicist and astronomer Carl Sagan, he had this saying, we're all stardust. I mean, essentially, our bodies are comprised of the same elements that make up stars and other distant bodies in the universe.
Yes.
And that's a beautiful thought.
It's a beautiful thought. So let's say, for the sake of argument, people listening, that there is an afterlife and you have to prepare for it a certain way. Is there a disservice not to talk about it and say there is something to prepare for? So live a good life, be moral, be kind, develop virtues, all of that.
I would say, so as first, and I appreciate your good question, at first I was about to preface my remarks by saying, well, I'm taking off my psychology hat and putting on my Zen hat.
All right.
But I'll also I'll say that I don't think the hats are that different sometimes, which is to say, as a therapist, I've worked with people who are Christian or people who are Muslim or people who are atheist. And I would say as a therapist, what is skillful for the person in the moment? What is skillful for them? Mm-hmm. What works for them? And as a Buddhist, I'd say the same thing. Mm-hmm. What works for the person in the moment? That's the key.
Interesting. It's very interesting. I think it's very difficult to grasp what you're saying. It sounds deceptively simple.
Well, is it so difficult? I think sometimes we're conditioned to think a particular way. We are. But I think, and that's the beauty of multicultural approaches, is we can learn so much from other cultural perspectives. It is interesting, and Richard Dawkins talks about this idea, the physicist the biologist Richard Dawkins. We're conditioned to think of death as a bad thing, and certainly death is scary. I don't want to die, and at the same time, why don't we ever talk about the miracle that is human existence? The fact that we are here right now, wherever you are listening to the show, the fact that evolution happened, that you emerged into this world, that everyone you know emerged into the world, the odds are staggeringly against that. And yet here we are. What a gift. Why, instead of thinking of death as automatically, always, inevitably, universally a bad thing, what if instead of thinking of it as something to be feared, we think of it as the capstone, the summation of our existence? The fact that we're mortal beings forces us to ask, how will we live? And it's an interesting question to say, how do I want to die? Mm-hmm. Those are important questions.
Exactly. And I want to talk about that. So birth and death are parentheses. And your life is somewhere in between, and you want to give it meaning.
Yeah.
And while you are here, live your best life, whatever that means to you individually. And of course, be of service to the community. Learn your lessons as best as possible, right? And bloom where you're planted, wherever in life that you are led, be the best that you can be. So that's a wonderful idea. Let's talk about preparation for death.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
I would say for myself, I think every moment of my existence is preparation for death. Every single moment. So whenever there's any kind of change that I don't like like my car was just breaking down a lot. And I'm not good at fixing cars. Actually, I'm okay, but it's not my forte.
Maybe you can become one with your car.
Well, actually, yes. In a serious note,
Yes.
So I got this mechanic helping me out, and I drive the car around, and I try to meditate while I'm
That's
driving my
right.
Buick. Yeah.
There you go.
To diagnose it. Everything in our existence is preparation for other forms of change. Every single thing. And so, I'm not being naive when I say this. Your difficulty is also your potential vehicle for liberation.
So the obstacle is the path.
Yes, the obstacle is your teacher.
That's a hard one for some people.
Of course. But that's also the hard spaces is where we grow. Just like if you're lifting weights, you kind of tear down your muscle fiber so that it can grow and be stronger. When people endure trauma, great psychological trauma, and trauma happens in this world. When we experience trauma, you may not emerge as the exact same person, but you can emerge more whole eventually. And that is the human journey. And I think there are teachers, whether they're Martin Luther King, whether they're Mahatma Gandhi, whether they're the Dalai Lama, there are people who have embodied that wisdom and that experience.
Mm-hmm. And also some unspoken, unsung hero somewhere
Absolutely.
in our lives.
Absolutely.
So you don't have to be on the world stage in order to have that kind of wisdom.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of trauma. There are individuals who've been wounded.
Yeah.
And their whole life is a journey towards healing.
Yeah.
However we want, whether we're mindless or mindful through the process, it's still a journey. We're making choices.
Yeah.
So what would you say as a therapist and a monk to those that are listening that have been injured in some, we have the whole gamut of trauma, but of course our experience and what we think about it defines our trauma as well. So what would you say?
Yeah. It's a little hard to answer, only in the sense that I do think sometimes, not to be punny, but the devil's in the details, And so are we talking about the military trauma and the trauma of war? Are we talking about sexual trauma, to be blunt? Are we talking about crime? The details matter. And a couple things I would offer. One, I do believe that healing is possible. And I've seen that occur in many contexts and settings. Two, we all need a helping hand sometimes. We all need assistance. And I do think that until you can let some type of healing or assistance in, then you might have a little more difficulty. We all need assistance. And that assistance might look differently. Maybe it's your therapist, maybe it's a minister, maybe it's your dog, maybe it's your pet. But I think one of the key steps in healing trauma is our community, is receiving care from other people and being able to embrace the idea that we are all worthy of healing.
So you come from a faith tradition that you were raised in where confession is a very strong part of that spiritual practice. Does it exist in Buddhism, and is it part of healing to confess what has happened and or talk about our trauma?
Well, and you're raising two great questions that I hear. One is the idea of confession, and to my knowledge, and I could certainly be wrong because Buddhism is vast, but to my knowledge, there is not a confession ritual like the sacrament of, there's 7 sacraments in Roman Catholicism, like the sacrament of reconciliation. To my knowledge, there is not that same ritual in Buddhism, to my knowledge. At the same time, there's certainly within Buddhism an absolute spiritual paramount need to apologize and to make amends. I would offer from a Buddhist perspective, and this isn't to minimize the importance of mistakes or responsibility, but I do think that sometimes, and I think history is filled with these examples as well, to use a Christian example, they say that Saul became Paul. I do think transformation is possible, and I do think that people who make immense immense mistakes can become whole again and learn from their mistake. So there is a part of me that's hesitant to use language like confession personally with my Buddhist hat on, because I think sometimes using language like confession implies a dichotomy of experience and implies judgment that I'm not sure is psychologically skillful, quite
Very
frankly.
interesting. So let's use another Christian term, redemption.
Sure.
Is there a concept of redemption? Is that what healing within Buddhism means?
Redemption. I would say within Buddhism, we talk about embracing existence. And that gets back to kind of what I was saying with my therapy hat on, if you
Yes,
will.
of course.
With redemption, there's this idea, I think, often that we are sinners and then we become saints. What I would say instead is that there's the totality of who you are, and being a sinner, so-called, is also part of your path of being a saint. I don't think they're so different. And if people are sinners, so to speak, then there are reasons why then they're sinners. And I do think, too, I would offer, and this gets into, so I work a lot with GLBTQ clients, and I'm very supportive of gay rights. And I think sometimes we get into judgments about who's right and who's wrong. And
Who's
that's
pure, who is not.
Who's pure and who's not. And we do that in all kinds of ways. Like,
Yes.
I'm vegetarian. Sometimes vegetarians can be judgmental.
Really?
Not me, though.
No, it's those vegans,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
not the vegetarian.
I like breakfast too much. Breakfast tacos too much to be a vegan. No, I love vegans,
No,
but you know.
I know.
But it's a great example. We run around and we judge other people, and then we cause suffering. Why don't we take a step back and try to understand? Why don't we do that?
Now, David, this is the first time you've used the word suffering.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because and I would like you to define it, because in terms of the experience of trauma, but
Yeah.
just holding that thought for a moment, suffering in certain faith traditions is that pearl in the making.
Yeah.
Right? So great suffering causes great growth.
Yes.
But the way you're using suffering means what in Buddhism?
Suffering is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I think this has a lot of implications clinically as a therapist, too. In Buddhism, there's a concept that gets used to illustrate the complexity of suffering. One concept is there's a term samsara, and it means literally in Sanskrit to journey. And so when we are suffering, we are on a journey. And when we are suffering, we are clinging to things that cause us to suffer more. And so there you see a nice intersection between Buddhism and psychology. You know, Buddhism says suffering is clinging to things that cause us to become ensnared. It's kind of like you can visualize a vortex and you're kind of descending down that vortex. And so if we think of, therapy, whether it's depression, it's an anxiety disorder, it's addiction, you're clinging to things which are keeping you stuck. And see, that's the difference between pain and suffering. And I think this is a key point. We will all experience pain. I'm a Buddhist priest. I meditate a lot. I still feel pain. I still feel sadness. And sometimes the more you do in this world, the more joyful you are, the more you change and grow and bring beauty into the world. You may even feel more pain sometimes. But the difference between pain and suffering is that in suffering, you are stuck. And in suffering, you are clinging and you are attached to things that keep you sucked into that vortex. Pain, you experience things fully and you continue to be part of the process. In suffering, at least for a little while, you are stuck. That is the difference.
Very interesting. So again, I know I keep talking about trauma because I feel like our listeners, there's some individuals who are really searching for answers. And I think when you are suffering, you will seek an answer everywhere.
Yeah,
because you need relief.
Yeah.
You want an end to your suffering.
Yeah.
So if someone has been injured, let's say through a personal experience, what is the path? What is it that they could do right now? We have about 7 minutes left. Is there something that you could lead everyone in terms of
Oh,
a
sure.
mindfulness practice?
Yeah, we could do a guide on how we have about 7 minutes.
About
How
7
much minutes should we use?
We can use exactly 7 minutes
Okay.
because I have a few minutes after that. So
Okay.
yes.
Well, and so I do want to say, because I'm sure some of our listeners are driving in
Yes,
cars.
yes.
So there's different forms of meditation. And
Yes.
if you're driving or operating heavy machinery, you got to be careful about
Thank
blissing
you.
out.
Blissing out. I like that.
Right. So those of you who are in cars, or you need to have a more modulated
Yes.
meditation.
Exactly. That's right.
Which actually is a good fit with mindfulness, because mindfulness is about being present, actually. So what I would encourage you to do, wherever you are, if you're walking your dog, if you're driving in a car, if you're sitting around the kitchen table, I would invite you first, as part of the meditation practice, as we ease into a meditative state, to get your body comfortable, whatever that looks like for you. And take just a moment to notice your body and get your feet and your arms and your legs. Allow them to be comfortable for you. Allow your spine to be in a comfortable position. And see if you can just allow yourself to relax. See if you can even allow your facial muscles to relax. We spend so much time during the day rushing around. See if you can allow yourself to relax. And as we are meditating together, see if you can allow yourself to breathe deeply, not in a forced way, but as you naturally can. Breathe slowly and deeply, feeling the air go in and go out, and feeling the natural pause that occurs between each breath, breathing in and breathing out, and breathing in and breathing out. And if your mind becomes distracted, that's okay. Distractions are a normal part of life. Just gently bring yourself back to your breathing. Breathing in and breathing out. Allowing yourself to relax and giving yourself some positive energy and attention. Giving yourself some self-care. And it's good to care for yourself sometimes. The more you can care for yourself, the more you can care for others. Breathing in and breathing out, gently bringing yourself always back to your meditation. And remembering that this state of calmness, this state of relaxed attention, is always available within you. You have the potential for healing and transformation simply by slowing down and paying attention to your breathing. And as we near the end of our meditation, congratulate yourself for giving yourself a little energy and a little attention, and perhaps make a resolution to care for yourself. Thank you, my friends.
It's so strange that the breath is there, but you're not aware of it. When you find it, it anchors you down very
Yes.
deeply within yourself. So what happens now if you're beginning to feel some discomfort or that's the body speaking?
Yes. So sometimes meditation is an infinite teacher. And sometimes, for example, I have a bad back. So sometimes we slow down and we meditate and we discover some pains that we've been ignoring. Well, thank you for that teaching. Maybe I need to do some more skillful self-care,